Greetings, non-Western art appreciation students. I hope you're doing fantastically well. Again, today I come to you from the Great Wall of China, from Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom that is known as China. When last we left you, we were talking about Chinese painting and how the best Chinese artworks, often done by amateurs, combine the idea of Confucianism as well as Taoism. So these kind of aspects of philosophy and religion coming together. And we had mentioned, as kind of a quick review, that Ren reigns supreme, the idea of human-heartedness, human kindness, and that within Confucianism, the thing underneath Ren is going to be called filial piety, the idea that there are key relationships, that when you enter into a relationship, you have responsibilities as well as expectations in that those elements, whether that happens to be ruler, subject, father, son, husband, wife, older brother, younger brother, friend to friend, and always there's a superior and an inferior representation of that particular aspect. And so you can see them here: parents to children, elderly to young, rulers to ruled, men to women, friend to friend, and the different aspects that show up within these. As such, in those key relationships, let's look how Confucianism actually plays out in individual artworks that is not landscape painting. So landscape painting, remember, it's the behavior of the trees and mountains to one another. And this particular artwork, and I love this artwork, this is the Admonitions of the Imperial Instructresses by Guo Kwan. This is the oldest Chinese hand scroll piece that we actually have. So one of the oldest forms of Chinese painting. And so it dates all the way back to the 5th century. So that would be the time of the Romans. We don't have much Roman painting that remains either. And so how does this hand scroll illustrate Confucian concepts? So here's the story, and it's labeled out. Here's Lady Fang right here. Here's the circus bear, and here's the emperor. When a great black bear escaped from its cage, the beautiful court Lady Fang, seen right here, rushed forward. How could she have been without fear? She knew she might be killed, but she did not care. So how does this show Confucian relationships? All right, Lady Fang herself, being of the lower element than the emperor himself, the ruler to the ruled, needs to protect the emperor. A woman, also the idea of protecting the emperor, this high authority that shows up. And so she was praised for risking her own life to save that of the beloved emperor that shows up. Another image from the Admonitions of the Imperial Instructors by Guo Kwan. Lady Bon, consort of Emperor Chang, so one of the lovers of Emperor Chang of the Han Dynasty from 33 to 7 BCE, who refused to ride in the palanquin, thus the carriage here, as she said that paintings of wise rulers always showed them in the company of their ministers, whereas paintings of decadent rulers always showed them in the company of their wives and concubines. And so this wise woman, to protect the image of the emperor, even if she would like to be with the emperor and the emperor would like to be with her, she knew it was a part of the marketing aspect, that the emperor in painting should be seen with ministers and people that are guiding the official policy rather than with lovers or with lies and with wives. And that's why she chose to walk outside of the palanquin in those beautiful robes that shows up. That's how we see Confucian values coming across within painting. Now, as we think about Chinese painting and the larger landscape painting, remember we talked about a bunch of different things last time in terms of how do we evaluate Chinese painting. So something to keep in mind because you're about to make one of these Chinese paintings within class. So the questions we should be able to answer about all Chinese landscape paintings are the following. What Confucian social relationships are being shown? Are the mountains leaning into one another? That's a tight family union. Are there equivalent heights or lower heights showing power dynamic? Are the trees reaching over to hug and grab one another? How many men are at this gathering? Remember, we count either the mountains or the trees, whichever one dominate the painting, not both. How many women are at this gathering? Here we actually have to do that mathematical equation, where the idea is the number of men that we found from either mountains or trees over the mountain space, where we count both mountains and trees, will equal the number of women over the percent remaining of the female space. So if there's 70 male space, then there must be 30 female space. And so we cross multiply to find the answer. What are the relative ages of the men depicted? How tall, how withered are they in the trees? How many leaves and branches are there? Are they leaning over? How does this painting explore the way of the Tao? the way of energy, the marriage of opposites, yin and yang. And finally, how does the painting show the flow of energy, qi? In any of our landscape paintings behind me here, we should be able to identify that and have a way of doing it, which means we can reverse engineer and have you design your own painting based upon the experiences that you had during the weekend, provided that you had an experience that involved at least one male, because we have to show the men. The women, remember, are a percentage, so we can't say, oh, I missed, that's women. Well, yeah, it is women's feminine space, but I can't say whether that's a woman or not. The Chinese just don't have that. And amongst all of this, we're also going to have inherited traditional practices in Chinese landscape that show up. There's almost always going to be a large central mountain. We're going to have the shifting perspective. So when you look head on, you're going to be looking at the trees, but then the clouds, which we would expect way up here in a Western perspective, because we go in distance this way, in Chinese culture, they're behind the last group of mountains, and they're just left open. We generally don't see clouds. That last set of billowy surfaces you see are mountains in the distance. The viewer does nature. You walk into it. You smell, you sip, you feel, you wipe mist off. And as the viewer's eyes move throughout the painting, the viewer creates personal meaning. Where do you want to go? How do you want to fit in? It's open-ended for the viewer. There's generally always small figures that are hidden to show you how powerful nature and energy and the qi and the Tao are, and how small you are. And it's your role to figure out how do you fit in with this larger expanse of which you're a minuscule part. So we often have small figures travel behind. And oftentimes there'll be one side that's open, and the other side will have a big rock or densely packed forest. So you enter in from a particular way. And all those things are actually built into Chinese painting, as we can actually see in an artwork like this. So in this particular painting, this is one of the most famous Chinese paintings of all time. This is the autumn colors in the Hua and Hua Mountains by Zhao Mengfu from 1296. I will tell you, this is one of my favorite Chinese paintings. I think it's actually just beautiful. I love how the color plays out, which we generally do not get very often in Chinese painting. So this is actually done during the Yuan dynasty, Y-U-A-N, and that was a problematic dynasty in Chinese history, because it is when, behind me, the Great Wall of China gets breached by bribing an individual to opening up the gate, allowing the Mongol hordes army to come in and rule over China for the better part of about 80 years. Now, as China was struggling, what Zhao Mengfu did, and what a lot of the government officials that were literati, you had two choices. You could continue to work with the Mongol Empire, in which case, on some level, it became a question, a moral question for you. Are you actually being a traitor by working for a foreign government and helping them to rule over a foreign land that you want to be freed? Or are you doing your Confucian value by staying on and actually helping the poor individuals? And there's not really a simple answer to that, because Ren, the highest trumping agency that shows up, could be interpreted either way in this case. So this is a moral quandary. Some artists decided to stay on and help. Other artists in literati decided to actually go into the field and go away. So for example, last time we saw the wonderful artist Neat Zan, where you looked at the tree painting and you analyzed the 5 trees. There was really 6 trees because they shared a root ball at the bottom called the Rongshai Studio. That individual, Neat Zan, decided to actually retire from government work and went off during the Yuan dynasty and became a recluse. Now, luckily, he had a job and he had enough money to be able to do this, enough property. So he decided the best thing to do was not support the government, because the government was not Chinese born. Zhao Mengfu, on the other hand, decided to stay on and work and help support the poorer and the lower class population in China so they weren't brutalized by a foreign power, the Mongols, when they came in. Zhao Mengfu is one of the most famous horse painters. It's one of the reasons the Mongols actually loved his artwork. In this particular artwork, what I love about it is that he is actually referring back to an earlier time period in Chinese history. The high point in Chinese history is either the Han or the Tang dynasty. And many people will say the Tang dynasty is when China reaches its cultural refinement in terms of painting, in terms of poetry, in terms of calligraphy. So in this case, he's referring back to a time period when China was awesome. China was great. So they had blue-green colored landscapes. So the ink washes and paints often have this blue-green. So even though they lived during a foreign dictatorship, He literally, while he was serving this dictatorship to help his average people out and fulfill his role of Ren, he decided that he would paint a beautiful Tang landscape as a painting for another friend. Again, still a gift, showing the beautiful kind of references back to, remember when the Tang dynasty was so great? It's kind of like in the United States when we say, remember the good old days? And we don't really know when we're referring back to, but we know it's not today, which has problems. That's exactly what Zhao Mengfu is, except he's specifically referring, saying, remember the good old days, the Tang dynasty? Remember the good old days, the 1960s or the 1950s in the US? In this painting, you would count the number of trees. So you can see it gets to be an arduous task. And now the number of trees in this particular artwork are going to represent the number of men. You will note then as you start to figure out the Confucian relationships, look at the men here. Those men, note, they're all about the same height, so they probably all have equivalent status. But note, we have a whole range of ages. We've got an elderly gentleman over here with not a lot of trees leaning over. We've got some very straight upright trees that are just starting to hit puberty with some leaves. We've got one that's fully fledged. So we might have a 70-year-old, we might have a 60-year-old, we might have a 50-year-old, we probably have a 30-year-old, and that's probably it. You'll also notice that we see little boats and fisheries tucked in. And that is largely because during Taoist retreats, or when you go to celebrate the moonlight, you really are celebrating Taoism, your place with the universe, where you fit in at these Taoist wonderful kind of social gatherings, but also parties where you can let your guard down. A lot of times people will have a little bit of alcohol, a little bit of drink that will loosen them up even more, become more in tune with nature and its beautiful and its beauty on these moonlit nights. And if you wanted a real experience, maybe you thought, I need to go and get really close to nature, convene with nature, be with nature. So a fair number of individuals, Taoist poet writers, Taoist painters, Taoist literati would get on these little boats and go out into the middle of the lake so they'd be by themselves. They would hear the party and see the beautiful lights in the distance, but they'd be able to look at the reflection of the moon in the water. And some of them wanted to embrace the reflection of the moon. So they would actually try to hug the moon. And in the process of hugging the moon, some of them fell in. As you've had a little bit too much alcohol, a number of Taoist poets actually drowned on these Taoist moonlit nights trying to embrace the moon. One such poet that we know of is the poet Li Po, who you read last time in the poem Drinking Alone by Moonlight. He actually died of a drowning accident during one of these Taoist outings that shows up. So the party would have taken place in these smaller houses like we saw in the Rongshai studio, but note the number of people. So we have the Confucian value. Note, here we have a group of older individuals drooping over leaves, the idea of the weeping willow that shows up. Here we have about, very craggly old men, probably even older than here, that have lost their. So they're in groups largely based upon age in different capacities and different number. The closer the roots are, like in this case, they're related. These are probably friends. These are friends. Note how these are probably all friends, and note how the branches come together and roach over. They're probably reaching out to shake hands, hug one another. That's what we're looking at by Zhao Mengfu, a literati master who gives this as a gift after being at a party. You can notice all the beautiful writing and poetry and colophon seals that show up on this. Now, as we look at Chinese culture, one of the things we have to consider, and this is going to be true here and in Egypt, and all around the world, even Day of the Dead, ancestral festivals everywhere, is the importance of death and ancestors in early civilizations. And so for men and for women who are powerful, they're going to have powerful burials, largely because they believe in an ancestral world where what they take with them in death, they will get to use in the next world. So to represent this in early China, and we'll see this in the pyramids of Egypt, we'll see this in the mummification that takes place with Incan rulers in Peru. This is Lady Di. So note, a very powerful woman. These are her burial coffins and her banner. These date from a high period in Chinese history called the Han Dynasty, 2nd century BCE, right during the Roman Empire, right when they're taking over the Greeks for comparison model. And you can see they're nested wooden boxes here that are beautifully decorated with this beautiful banner actually in the burial center in the middle of the burial mound. Now, this shows the Han mythocentric way that they were looking at the universe. And so we have a Taoist duality of the moon with a toad representing the moon right here and the sun representing the crow over here. A dragon with a human head right here represents the great ancestor. And the toad symbolizes longevity and purity. An eclipse then was, by the Chinese, believe it was the sun being swallowed by the moon. So that's what it would actually cause here. They're going to have flying dragons showing prosperity. Dragons later on are going to be the symbol of the emperor himself. As we go down to the bottom world and looking at the underworld from the top, you'll note there's a bronze fang ding, which I'll show you in a minute, which is ritual wear for different ceremonies that would take place. You would have ritual food and wine vessels in the fang ding. You have the earth deity right here, look, holding up the earth. Snakes surrounding him, shape-shifting, but snakes might also be represented as evil as well. So the underworld is holding up the world so that the mourners can pray and be with their loved ones for a while. You're going to see a black carp, which means overcoming adversity, the idea of death being a major adversity. Goats, these loving, selfless creatures that people had. And the beings represent elements of water, which is the fish, and earth of the goats. And all the way at the bottom, you're going to see these lovely little bai discs made of jade for longevity, which are little symbols that show up. And in my class, I'll actually show you one of these beautiful jade bais that show up. Now, when we look at Chinese jade, jade represents many virtues because of its hardness, its durability, its beauty, and the Chinese equate beauty with morality, as we often did all the way up until Immanuel Kant in the Western world. And this idea of this very beautiful translucence. Jade is often almost always buried with the dead. It can be actually a complete burial outfit, or it can be these little jade bai burial discs of heaven that actually are used as jewelry as you go on to the next world. Very wealthy individuals would be able to afford such things as dragon beds here, where you can see the opening. Jade was used as a wedding bracelet, and particularly translucent green jade for our 20th wedding anniversary. 20th anniversary, ironically, is the China anniversary. So my wife and I went to China, and on our 20th wedding anniversary, I got her a lovely wedding bracelet in a Chinese tradition. So she has a Western ring and a Chinese wedding bracelet. And finally, they're going to use the dragon. And also, a dragon in jade is super powerful. It's hard, it's durable, it's beautiful, it's translucent, it's moral, it lasts forever. And jade is incredibly hard to carve. So this intricate detail is only done by the highest level of individuals. Now, jade basically can be formed in 6 major shapes amongst the Chinese world. And if you owned all 6, it meant you had the power over earth and heaven. And the only person that was ever allowed to own all 6 was the emperor himself. And so if we look at these 6 different shapes of jade, only the emperor owned all 6 at once. You could own 5 if you were super wealthy or of the imperial family, but only the emperor would own all 6. So the 6 ceremonial Chinese jade. Here we have a klong, which is basically means the word square. This represents earth. Whenever you see squares, it's earth. Whenever you see in Chinese culture circles, that's a bai, and that's the symbol of heaven. So when we put circles on top of squares, we have the idea of earth and heaven come together. Note, in the Western tradition coming across the Silk Road, we don't know who came up with the idea first, but that's exactly what a dome is. A dome, really, you start with a square base, and you end up with a circular top, all the way in such artworks as, you know, the Pantheon in ancient Rome, which meant that gods and people would meet, the earthly realm and the heavenly realm. The Chinese have the same concept here. They're going to also have a zhang, which is a jade axe, which happens to be right here. A hu, which is a jade wine vessel. A wang, a pendant. And notice also that actually is a symbol of the north. And note each one of them has a symbol then. And the gui, which is actually this shape here, which is a long pillar for the east. So by combining all these different elements, the emperor would have control over earth, over heaven, the combination of two, as the living embodiment of a god here on earth. They would control the south, the west, the north, and the east. So they control all 3-dimensional directions. The Chinese, also for these ceremonial grave goods that would appear in people's funerals, and also luxury items at home, are exactly this. They have the longest history of ceramic production in the world, And in the north and the south of China, they have different clays, which allows them to produce different ceramics. So here are some various ones that show, and I'll talk about the most famous ones. First of all, they're going to have sensai. Sensai is a lead glaze that gives you this beautiful orangish brown that shows up. During the Tang Dynasty, remember, one of the high periods in all of Chinese history, we have these beautiful images that are made of horses and of riders and of images of everyday life done in this beautiful lead glaze. Also during the Tang, they're going to invent what's called Celadon. And this is a transparent crackle glaze. So you literally can see through the glaze to see underlayers, and it crackles like we have crackling sometimes in painting techniques, which almost appears like little squiggles and rocks that show up that kind of show age, but also a beauty of an underlying piece underneath. They're going to invent roux-ware, which is stoneware, but note, here you can really see that beautiful bluish crackle that shows up. This is a song piece that shows up. They're going to develop tri-colored porcelain. And the idea of porcelain is amazing. So all porcelain down here is white translucent ceramic. So this beautiful where light can penetrate and you get this lustrous glow back. Once Europeans saw this, they couldn't get enough of this. And so they would order thousands and thousands and thousands of tons from China every year. They wanted porcelain for beautiful kind of Victorian tea sets and for their housewares, and they wanted silk from China. And the other one is the blue and white from the Qing Dynasty, blue and white porcelain with beautiful elements sometimes, and in both of these cases, the representation of the emperor, which is the dragon himself. The other image that often is used, both in household usage, but also in very beautiful uses along with jade and porcelain, are going to be bronzes. Bronzes and using for China are generally ritual offerings for the spirit worlds, especially in the idea of agriculture, because they're meant for wine and food. So we're going to have a gui, a communal heated wine bowl that shows up here, a gu, a small heated wine vessel. So this is for larger events. This is for a family event. A fang ding for communal meats, and we saw that actually in Lady Di's funeral. A ding vessel, the Tao Ti design for meat protection, and that design right here. Here are the eyes, here the nose, here's the mouth. It's like this biomorphic creature that shows up. And note, many of these have the tripod that show up. The main ideas of Confucian values that holds up a society can be read in a couple different ways in the Chinese world. One is you have the visible world, the less visible world, and the moral world. So visible, less visible, ancestral world, the God world, and the moral world, the decisions that have to be made between the two. You can look at it as family, right here being one of the main supports, government being one of the main supports, and your extended family when you get married being one of the main supports. This could be children, the next generation of parents, and then grandparents. But note, it's all about a supporting technology, because if you lose one at any given point, the entire system falls with these tries. And so a lot of Chinese individuals will have some version of this tripod at their home. And I know when we were in China, we got ourselves like a gu, a heated wine vessel that actually has a 3 tripod stance. And that is our family thing. When we talk to our children about our family rights, we tell them you have family responsibilities, what you do to help your family out. You have your own educational responsibilities, what you do in the homework that you do within the process to help out. And then you have a communal responsibility. What do you do to help the larger world out? And that is our family pillars that we've used from Chinese offerings. So all of them are done. Now, don't worry about if you don't know the names of these. I'm never going to test you on the names, but I want to give you an idea of the variation of forms that show up across jade, across Chinese bronze. And the way that they're made is called cire perdu, which is the lost wax casting way, still a very common way that we make bronze art today. So this is a piece mold process. And look how beautiful that is. And so that's how all of these different surfaces, whether it's the Fang Ding, the Gui, the Gu, the Ding Fang, it's how all these ritual bronzes were made is through the seer Perdue. The most amazing accomplishment in bronze technology, or one of the most amazing, there's one that's more, is this. And this is called a cosmic mirror, or the TLV mirror. This is from the Han Dynasty. And everything with all the little details here is absolutely symbolic. You'll note that if you really look very closely, the shape and the layout here is very similar to what we looked at the lovely gates of heaven for the Forbidden Palace, where you have an outer gate, an inner gate, some flares of water. Note, the T's are actually the gates here. So here's a T, there's a T, here's an upside down T, here's a T. Those are the gates of heaven, really separating the world from heaven itself. And remember, heaven is a square. I'm sorry, Earth is a square, our world is a square. Heaven is the giant circles that happen to be out here. The L's are the marshes and the swamps beyond the Chinese border. So once you leave the gates, here are the L's that show up. And the V's are the winds that are actually beyond the Chinese border, all before you get into the realm of the heavens. So if you look at this, I'll make myself a little smaller here. Look at all the different things that you can actually see, and all of them are symbolic, like we have in Western art. We're just not used to seeing all the symbols. So heaven was round, so we see that round shape of the overall things, which contains everything, including the earth. The dragon scrolls around, and if you really look, there are 9 different dragon scrolls, symbol of perfection for the emperor. From center to the outer circle represents China itself. So from center on out, this is the Chinese Forbidden Palace. Here's the rest of the lands. The outer area over here represents the 4 seas, the water that surrounds the heavens. There are 8 outer nipples. If you count these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Those are the 8 mountains that are holding up the earth from the heavens, separating the two, most of them in the Himalaya mountains. There's a inner square that represents the middle kingdom. That's China itself. That's this square right here. There's 9 inner nipples that represent the 9 regions of Earth. The swirls up here then, right before you get to the lovely dragons around, are the swirls are the clouds, so the heavens. The L's are the marshes behind the Chinese border. And the bending, when things bend, equals the fact that season changes, a Taoist concept. Note in the south, the west, the north, and the east, you get different images that show up when you really do look at this. So the south has a red bird for summer and fire. The west has a white tiger and a fallen metal. So basically, it's the Chinese cosmological union of all 4 directors, heaven, waters, and earth. It is a symbol of the world that they live in. So one of the things that shows up that I'd like to introduce you to is sometimes considered the greatest accomplishment of Chinese bronze casting ever. And it's these individuals here, these bronze bells, the Jinjon bells. They rank among the highest achievements of Chinese bronze casting technology or bronze casting technology anywhere in the world. Yet the secret of their design and the method of casting them, which was known only to the Chinese in antiquity, we still have lost it in generations. So we're still working on trying how to do this bronze making technology as it shows up. It's pretty remarkable within it. And if you look at this, and we're going to listen to these bells as well, as we do have a way of playing them here in a moment. So here's what the bells sound like. They often have two different notes. So far, we're not listening to the bells. This is another musical instrument we'll hear. Here's the bells. If you ever go to Walt Disney World in Orlando, they have a model of these in the Chinese pavilion. And each bell, which is remarkable, has two different tones depending upon where you play it. So that means the thickness and the bosses, these things here, have to change to get the two different tones accurate to be able to represent the entire scale in Chinese musicality. Now, as we're thinking about the Chinese and their masterful, what they're able to do, the other thing we want to consider is actually Chinese gardens. So this is one of the great gardens from China, and I'll show this to you. So this is the master of the Nets gardens. Most famous gardens are these what are called scholars gardens. They are members of the literati. So this is where these night parties would take place, where as an amateur you would be invited to understand not just the garden itself, but also the wonderful nature and where you fit in with the Tao and see the moonlit night that shows up. It is a sensorial experience, and there are some of the most beautiful places that are man-made on the planet in small gardens. So you'd imagine this would be basically the backyard that you would create using different elements from nature that you would spend years and years kind of grooming. So often windows frame garden views. So there might be a circular window into a square garden, so you get the idea of heaven and earth, or a square window into a circular area, or maybe a particular tree so that when the tree is in bloom in particular, you would see right through it. But the Chinese are brilliant. There might be a tree right behind it that's in bloom in a different season, so you would still see the colors through the tree that is actually set up. So the trees and the flowers provide aroma, and it was beautiful. And you would go here any year, any time of year except for winter and be able to smell it. The intricate designs, they will generally have that inlaid even in the pavement, and you would walk around and be able to feel the tactile experience of kind of touch that shows up. And there are meandering paths. You were meant to wander, not just walk in and out, kind of like true landscapes. And there are gorgeous places. Generally, this is an hour outside of Shanghai where the most famous gardens are. And so the essential elements that show up in a scholar's pond, which we will compare because later on we're going to see Japanese rock gardens and talk about the difference between Japanese and Chinese. Oftentimes in the West, we make the exception that everything in Japan and China is the same, couldn't be radically different. These two cultures really have not liked each other for the vast majority of history. So the essential elements of a scholar garden are that there's going to be mini mountains, man-made mountains that might be 30 feet tall, but that rise to sharp peaks. They're almost always going to have ponds and flowing water. It's going to be proximity to home. It's going to be parked generally in the backyard of the home. They're going to be small and they're going to be enclosed. So it's really for you and your family's viewership or your friends that come over. There are going to be individual different sections that might represent different elements. You might actually have one element for each season, or you might have one small element that's specifically for aroma. That's where the wind gently wafts it through. You might have an area that's more circular to concentrate on the Tao versus the square and the human element of Confucius. They're generally going to be asymmetrical, which is something they do pick up, and the Chinese are going to use as well. They're going to use chimes so you get little beautiful wind sounds. And there's going to be spatial connections. So you might turn from one way from looking and see a window behind you that brings you into a different section of the garden. There's almost always going to be some pavilion architecture, places for you to wander and while away the years and really understand where the beauty and different sensibilities as you walk around. And oftentimes there's a central pavilion architecture, flowing water and rocks, symbolic trees and plants. Willows, for example, are known in China as that which bends and doesn't break. So a lot of times they talk about this as being a female in China, the thing that bend but doesn't quite break, right? Women can bend over backwards to help men and their children without breaking. They support much more, whereas a man, an oak would just come tumbling down. They're going to have borrowed scenery. It's basically one element, if you look through a window, will give you this scene of another element, as we talked about. Incense burner, and the idea of feng shui. This is all about wind and water mountain movement. Where the breeze moves, let's not close off the breeze. Let's guide the breeze to bring that smell and that air-conditioned breeze all over the place. So they're going to actually use that to their advantage here. Chinese scholar gardens sometimes are also called poetic gardens, and they are a place for solitary social contemplation of the Tao and nature in your backyard. Nature was regarded as a friend and equal to man, and you were meant to spend some time outside on your own, contemplating with the Tao and with nature. Creation, then, considered so complex that only a scholar, a master literati, was capable of completing it. Thus, the garden was a measure of someone's knowledge, of how much they knew about Confucianism, Taoism, the flow of energy, feng shui throughout the process. And so here's another master of the next garden, one of my favorite gardens in the world. And at night, of course. Even then, it's lit up. Now, all of this gets into the idea of Tai Chi and the importance of exercise. If you don't know this, exercise actually makes you smarter. Sounds strange because you're like, I've seen a lot of football players and stereotypical people that aren't that smart or don't use it. They might not have actually exercised and studied at the same time, right? They might have been only exercising, like Michael Jordan said, shooting 1,000 times a day, and rather than reading 1,000 books and exercising. But it impacts your brain. It can make you feel better as well. It actually helps you with connective flexibility, joints. It makes you stronger, healthier, or improves in balance. Exercise is a wonderful thing. In the Chinese, the dominant form of exercise besides martial arts is Tai Chi. So we could actually potentially try this in class. But here's what Tai Chi looks like. You'll note it's not fast. It's very slow. It's about harnessing, and a lot of the effects literally are like making a ball of energy, harnessing the energy and masculine and feminine yin yang elements that show up here. It's very slow. It's very graceful. It's about absolutely controlling your body and the flexibility. How do you harness the nature and the natural world of Qi? And how do you make it flow through your body with complete control? Note the repetition that shows up here. Same way we do kind of sets in our exercise to build muscle. And I'll fast forward through a couple more so you can see There's significant movements that you do over and over. You can see a lot of this actually ties in the Chinese tradition of martial arts, which is a sped up version of this. And both are meant to control the element of qi, the element of energy. How much energy do you control? And if someone throws a punch, for example, in the future in martial arts, can you control and block that energy and make it flow kind of like with judo against themselves? So these interlinking concepts all show up. So this is what you do for personal growth for yourself, Tai Chi. So when we were there, I brought my parents with me when I went on my last business trip to China. We actually did Tai Chi in the morning. So here's the Tai Chi master. And we were all trying the different elements of Tai Chi that show up, including my mom. My dad had no interest. My dad's not nearly as adventurous, but my dad did share some cobra venom liquor. There's the actual cobra with me later on that night. Now, as we go through and we think about the different elements, the flow of energy, it also is going to impact Chinese traditional music. Now, in Chinese traditional music, there is no absolute tone, really, until the 20th century. And so it is relative to a tone that you tune your instrument for the other ones that are here. Now, if you ever go to an early Chinese tea ceremony performance, you, as an amateur, are more than welcome to show up on stage early on, and perform. And you can perform in whatever instrument you so choose. As better people come up, they will take the instrument from you until at the end, at about 4 or 5 o'clock at a tea house, you'll have almost nearly professional performers. Actually, they're amateur performers who just practice all the time, probably good enough to be professional, will then be performed. And the major instruments then that we have that are going to be seen in these ceremonies, one is going to be the yang qin, or yang qin, which is a 21 string, basically a hammered dulcimer, and you can play 2 and 3 notes by plucking them at the same time. You're going to hear a DZ, which is a horizontal bamboo flute, which has a very high pitch. An erhu, one of my favorite instruments, which is a 2-string lute, and it's got a python skin resonator there. And a pipa, a 4 plucked strings that you play very fast with the vibration called tremolo, and that was used for entertainment. Now, if you look at these different elements and all the things that go into it, what Chinese traditional music does is this. It takes the energy of the universe and brings it together in a beautiful sound for harmony. The Ba Yin, there are 8 sounds of heaven and earth in harmony. And the 8 sounds that we will see here are metal, stone, bamboo, earth or clay, gourd, skin, wood, and silk. And if you look really hard, you will find there is metal, there is stone, there is bamboo, there is earth, there is gourd. Sometimes this will be made from gourd. There is skin, there is wood, and there is silk, depending upon the different strings that are played. And so this combines the 8 sounds of heaven as they show up. So the first sound of heaven, let's listen to a DZ. So this is the sound of DZ and one of the 8 sounds of harmony in the universe. If we go to the next one, we'll listen to one of my favorite instruments, the erhu. So I'm hoping this one's the erhu. All of that beautiful sound from 2 strings. Almost always with a python skin resonator that's made of a gourd. Again, we're going to add 3 different sounds from the harmony of the universe here. Next one up then. So we're going to listen to the yang kin, which is very similar to the chin that all literati learn how to play. This is a non-portable version of it. And this is probably the most distinctive sound of Shen. Oh, actually, we're going to play the pipa first. And note you're playing more than one note at the same time often. And so when you put all of them together, what you're going to get is this: Chinese traditional music. There are only 25 compositions known from Chinese classical music. You play them from memory, there's no written music. There's no formal instructions. You can't really take lessons in the traditional format. You learn by playing by imitation and correcting your behavior. The tempo generally begins slowly and ends in a fast tempo, very similar to what we saw actually in Hindustani music. So this is called Jinjon Shiju. It's basically tea house music. It's got a fuzzy, thick timbre due to variously tuned instruments. Remember, there's no pure tone until the 20th century. And every instrument plays some basic element of the melody, but each player is improvising based upon the composition that's in front of us. When we do it beautifully, we get one of the greatest bands that actually shows up in China, which is the 12 Girls Band. These are all classically trained Chinese musical instruments who decided to work together to create a pop band using their instruments. And so one of my favorite songs of China is this one, and the music video is Freedom. So here's their music video. Superstar pop from China. There's your Yangkin. There's your Erhu. There's the DZ. And the people on the right. They travel internationally. I love them. Now, in this instrumentation, there's no drumming. So if you want to add drumming, you have to tap on your own instrument. So when you combine all those different elements, you get the elements of heaven and the universe being together, the circle, the square, and the Bai-Yin, all of them coming together. Now, when things are out of whack and not kind of in order, one of the things that shows up, and we're getting near midterm, it's the idea that you might hit rock bottom. Things might be hard, right? You're early in school, something's not going well. So I want to kind of shout out and talk about how do we overcome these things? Because these bad times, negative times will happen. Michael Jordan once said at the bottom over here, actually in the whole column over here, I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I've failed over and over and over again in my life. And that is why I succeeded. He was willing to take the risks. Take risks on yourself, but take calculated risks. Take those risks actually to make yourself better. Pick yourself up when actually you don't do your best, or where you didn't know what was your best or what you could achieve, but you really do need to take these. And the key here is then you need to have a growth mindset if you can work into this. Fixed mindset, basically a challenge comes up, oh, I can do it or I can't do it. Oh, an obstacle, I don't want to do that, right? You get these blockages. Growth mindsets, right? How do I overcome the obstacle? Rather than trying to go through how do I go around it? Are there alternatives here? How much effort do I put in? I need to work smarter, not more necessarily. How do I take criticism? Criticism is the opportunity to get better. And how do I help with the success of others and build upon? So as we looked at a growth mindset for a fixed mindset, the entire idea is, how do I use these opportunities to grow? When things come up and I'm like, all right, how do I get better? You get better by a growth mindset. I can overcome this. How can I overcome this? It sounds strange, but just a little switch actually will change and help you improve your grade and your performance. So I can do this. I need to plan out beforehand. Why didn't this go well? Well, I need to fix this for the next time. So it's called a growth mindset. And that is actually what your reading is for this week. Now, as we look at these and move more into modern China, look at this. This is a terrible image with a dead bird. But what is the meaning of this contemporary artwork? This is by Hong Li. It's called Dead Bird in Forbidden Palace. All right, and so it is on some level about death. Note the lovely rack focusing, which means in the background you have this very blurred image, but it's clearly that you're looking at one of the palaces of heavenly harmony that we actually saw from the Forbidden Palace. And the idea that this beautiful bird with jewelry wrapped around it, of that, probably means that something's coming to an end, or something is coming to a very bad conclusion. Now, in order to make sure things don't come to a bad conclusion, such as that lovely artwork, the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. And if you ever go to Walt Disney World in Florida, this is one of the things that the Chinese reproduced, and there's actually a Circle Vision movie inside of it. It's one of the most beautiful buildings that you have in China, and it combines the square and the circle, again, heaven and earth. Heaven on the bottom, earth on the top. So here you can see the square of the earth, and then the multiple circles rising up, the square for the earth in terms of the temple and the confines, and all the circular elements that lead you up to the high point, which is the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. And that's actually, like I said, square earth looking below up to the heavens for the circle as you mount these different things. Inside of the Temple of Heaven, there are these absolutely gorgeous, inlaid, beautiful, brightly colored circles, the ovals really reaching up and making you look up towards the heavens. This is where the emperors themselves would come to pray for a good annual harvest. There are 12-hour outer pillars which represent the 12 months, the 12 zodiac signs, the 12 hours for traditional timekeeping of how long until the sun came up and the sun went down. It is the model for the capital of our US Capitol Dome, and the Forbidden Palace, as we talked about last time, is the model for both Versailles and for later on Washington, D.C., laid out in that grid-like pattern. Once later on, the Chinese Communist Party takes over, and they take over in 1949. The person who's actually left in charge is Chairman Mao Zedong, sometimes just called Chairman Mao. He's considered the father of modern China, the father of Chinese communism, lives from 1893 to 1976. He does some wonderful and then some awful things in China. And so he's very much about unifying the people, getting individuals that are farmers really integrated within culture and moving China as a world superpower towards the modern world. The problem is his policies and some of the things he does cause catastrophic deaths, millions and millions. Maybe someone will even estimate the Great Leap Forward might have caused 25 million casualties as he's trying to promote forward. Now, in a communist control country, you get to control the message, and China still controls the message. You cannot go to China and use Facebook; they don't have it. You can't go there and use Twitter; they don't have it. They have a government-sponsored websites and searchers that will bring up things that the Chinese government wants you to see. So rather than having Google, there's no Google. Google brings everything. They have something called Baidu, and Baidu is operated by the Chinese Communist Party. So if you go there and you say, type in bad things about the Chinese government, you'll basically get nothing. Or you'll get, these dissidents believe that, but this is not right, and it will give you other information showing how great the Chinese government is. You say, do Tibet love being in Chinese control? And of course the answer will be yes. Here are 4 Tibetans that talk about how wonderful it is, and they won't talk to the other 13 million Tibetans about what it means to be, or the Dalai Lama. And so they're going to basically create a Chinese propaganda about how wonderful life is under Chairman Mao. And his image shows up everywhere. throughout China. He is basically the version, or what they have created the version of our George Washington, this mythical feature that everything is right about. And only recently has China started to deal with its history that, right, not everything that Chairman Mao did was good. That is really only a recent phenomenon. The other contemporary individual, and besides Chairman Mao, that had a huge impact, he's now Chinese American, or was Chinese American, he just died, unfortunately, is I.M. Pei. So he lived from 1917 to 2019, a very long life. And if you look at him, he's very famous for these angular pursuits of opposites that show up, really from Taoist architecture you can look at. He's responsible for creating the JFK Library, the Louvre Museum, not the museum itself, but the lovely open work grid work that's here, the Cornell Museum of Art, which is a very cool building, the National Gallery, both the inside and the exterior, the Dallas City Hall, and if you ever go to Indiana University, where I did my graduate work, which has one of the best African studies programs in the country, he designed their museum as well, the IU Art Museum. And they're all based upon Taoist concepts, right? The openness and the airiness versus the closed off space. The closed off space, and yet it's holding air within the process. The very rectilineal versus the very angular aspect. The light versus the darkness and what you can see in it. The curvilinear versus the angle coming out at you. The cantilevered, the line, almost like a reversed building that shows up. He really does have this wonderful sensibility, playing off these kind of Chinese concepts of the marriage of opposites coming from yin and yang, masculine and feminine. Another artist that's a Chinese American artist that challenges the bonds of what we're thinking about in China. So what are we going to do with Yun Bai? Yun Bai was a student here, getting her undergraduate degree in the 1990s. And Yun Bai, her father died while she was actually getting her degree. And so she was forced with the problem that she couldn't afford college. So she took some time off and she started doing porn movies. And you'll note her series then are these pornographic images of mostly of her own body, or people touching her body, her touching her own body from sex porn videos that she now uses basically as flowers as part of her art creation. So she's taking what she did not want to do and probably would never have to do if her father lived, and literally using it as an empowerment tool to show her, here's how I survived. Now some of her proceeds go to help women in porn who don't have another option like she did if she wants to get educated or get out within the process. So that's one of the things that Yun Bai, she sometimes goes by the individual Yummy Bunny. The most famous Chinese artist working today is arguably Guo Kwan from China in 1957. He's a neo-abstract expressionist. He uses colored gunpowder. What this means, neo is new. Abstract expressionism are the individuals like Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner used to throw paint on a canvas, acting through the canvas. And he's doing that, only he's using colored gunpowder. So here is one of the creations of his artworks. Here's how he lays them out. The other famous artist that actually shows up in China is this individual here. This is Ai Weiwei. And so he is a dissident artist. So he's been disciplined by the Chinese government a number of times for things such as showing images such as surveillance cameras and the idea that the Chinese nation state is always watching. These are rods that are actually called from straight after the earthquake that was actually in the Perez Art Museum a few years ago. And these actually were all rods that were destroyed that came out of buildings where people died in China. So he made them look like the continuous mounds. He reshaped them. He actually made them flat and then put them in piles, showing you the devastation and how much force and power it would take for an earthquake and why you need to build solidly so that people don't die in China. He has a Coca-Cola Ming vase. Very famous time period in China was the Ming Dynasty. So he said even the crass commercialization of the Ming, Coca-Cola has done it before. And then he breaks Ming vases as well. He's responsible for the bird's nest at the Beijing Olympics, which is used as for a number of different events during the Olympics. And so he's a very well-known dissident artist. And we have a Chinese millennial arts challenging postmodern globalization. This is Wu Hua, and this is the idea of Green Mao, a sacred leader on medium designed to get dirty and destroyed. It slowly disappears over time. So it's specifically using a paint that fades. Now, with all of these different things that shows up, here's what we have to talk about in modern China today. They have an enormous problem with pollution. They have a population that's 1.3 billion, and they want to be in the middle class and live very similar lives to Americans. But we have much more land mass, and we're much more spread out. You know, China, there's not a lot of area to live in certain parts just because there's no natural resources, there's no growing potential. They are experiencing a brain drain as they're going through economic development. Because as people come here to the United States from China and they want to get their master's and their PhD, they realize, wow, I really like the idea of freedom and studying and freedom of speech. And they go back in China to China and they feel stifled. So a lot of those individuals petition to stay here. They have huge human rights issues, right? It's a communist country. They want to control it from a communist country. And so they're trying to stifle out feminism as much as they possibly can, where women want rights. It is a society very much where men have been dominant, as we've talked about in the past, with even in terms of the Confucian relationships. So much of that, even Confucian relationships, you weren't allowed to talk about until very recently. They were outlawed by the Communist Party. And people just said, oh, it's just part of the culture. It's not really Confucian values. It is actually Confucian values when we talk about the idea of different relationships and Ren that shows up and following the government agencies that show up. They also have human rights abuses that are showing up with the Muslim population. There are 1 million Uyghurs that are actually locked up in basically work or retraining facilities where they're trying to train them not to be Muslim. So we have a more unified population, which is terrifying because that's happening in the modern day world and is one of our major trading partners. We're not actually dealing with that at all. They have an aging population, and with the one-child population, that means that not two people, but one person is responsible for taking care of two elderly adults because they don't have nursing homes. That's something that's just developing in China now, and so they do have a problem moving forward there. The idea is they have different entities within China that are treated differently. The Hong Kong is given different status than is Taipei, than is Macau. And so the mainland China has one set of rules, but then in Taipei, they have freedom of speech, as does in Hong Kong. And that rubs a bunch of different Chinese people the wrong way. They annexed Tibet a number of years ago. That's still a challenge because Tibet doesn't want to be annexed. And yet the Chinese people believe absolutely the Chinese people are better. Why? Communist government tells them what to think by controlling the internet. They've gone through the idea of Asian idol a number of different times. That's made a bunch of younger people ask, well, shouldn't I have the freedom of right to vote for who I want or to do what I want to do? Shouldn't I be able to vote for my government? So they've actually thought about banning Asian Idol in China. Problem is it's their #1 television show. And then we come with the challenges of what are we going to do with free Tibet? And so here's a video that talks about Tibet.
The Dalai Lama recently implied that he would be the last person to hold this position. After his death, there would not be another because the Dalai Lama
Think about how interesting this politics and religion is.
Free from Chinese rule. China disagrees and is calling on the Dalai Lama to respect the historic custom of reincarnation. There's a lot to explain in there, but let's first look at the relationship between China and Tibet. This is China and Tibet is here. The Tibetan people are a unique ethno-cultural group, and this is the area that many Tibetans think of as their homeland. China, who currently controls the area, only recognizes this section as being Tibet. They call it the Tibet Autonomous Region and like to represent it as just that, an autonomous region of China under Tibetan authority with an ethnically Tibetan chairman in charge. But in reality, an ethnically Chinese branch secretary of the Communist Party is the real authority there. Many Tibetans argue that the Tibet Autonomous Region isn't autonomous at all. And they have compelling reasons to argue that point. Tibet had independent rule under the authority of the previous Dalai Lama and other Tibetan Buddhist leaders in the beginning of the 20th century. In the 1940s, China took over. Then, after the Communist Revolution, the People's Republic of China invaded and incorporated Tibet. They did this by ousting the old Chinese government, installing the current 14th Dalai Lama as the new leader of Tibet, and getting him to sign the 17-point agreement. He was a teenager at the time, and the agreement was supposed to guarantee Tibetan regional autonomy and the respect of Buddhism in the region. This was in exchange for allowing China to set up civilian and military headquarters inside Tibet. The Dalai Lama has since repudiated this deal. He was also involved in the 1959 Tibetan uprising that ended with 80,000 Tibetans, including himself, fleeing the country for northern India. They live there today in exile and still campaign for Tibetan freedom. They fear that China is intentionally undermining Tibetan culture and way of life by encouraging mass Han Chinese migration to Tibet, building up industry there, and systematically pillaging Tibet's resources. They also accuse China of human rights violations and widespread persecution of the Tibetan people. On top of all of this, China also has a history of undermining the Buddhist religion. The Dalai Lama is both a political figure and a holy figure in Buddhism. He's the reincarnation of the previous Dalai Lama and was identified as such as a boy for his ability to recognize items owned by the previous Dalai Lama. Buddhism also has the Panchen Lama, who's the second most important figure in Tibet's spiritual hierarchy. He also plays a role in finding the next Dalai Lama. In 1995, the Dalai Lama identified a boy as the new Panchen Lama, but the Chinese government detained the boy and he hasn't been seen since. China also installed their own choice for the Panchen Lama, but he's not accepted by most Tibetans. With all of that in mind, you can see why the Dalai Lama would want to get the word out ahead of time about his not reincarnating in China. When the Dalai Lama passes on, there is reasonable concern that China will try to install their own representative in his place, which would obviously be detrimental to the fight for Tibetan freedom. If you'd like to learn more about issues abroad or here in the US, the Dalai Lama.
And so that's a very interesting thing to think of. So the last thing we will actually do as we go through is we'll give you a challenge A to Z as we listen to some Chinese chin music. Think of an artwork, a personality, an invention, or an aesthetic from each letter of the alphabet about China, A to Z, or come up with the top 10 things. Out of everything that we've learned and looked at, what are the 10 most important things you need to know to understand Chinese culture and art today? And I'll give you about 10 minutes to do either one. But those are the features that we want to talk about. Have a wonderful day, and I wish you all luck. Bye.